Toby. He pushed plates at me, and the Indian put bread and pork on them, and a glass of Madeira wine. I told him I was off the French ship, which I had joined on account of my mother being French. That was true enough when you think of it, and besides, I saw that the French was all the fashion in Philadelphia. Toby and the Indian whispered, and I went on picking up the pills. "You like pills, eh?" says Toby. "No," I says. "I've seen our ship's doctor roll too many of 'em." "Ho!" he says, and shoves 2 bottles at me. "What's those?" "Calomel," I says. "The other's Senna." "Right," he says. 1 week I have tried to teach Gert Squanfelder the difference between them, yet he cannot tell. "You like to fiddle?" he says. He'd just seen my kit on the floor. "Oh, yes," says I. "Oho!" he says. "What note is this?" drawing his bow across. He meant it for an A, so I told him it was. "My brother," he says to the Indian, "I think this is the hand of Providence. I warned that Gert, if he went to play upon the wharves any more, he would hear it from me. Now look at this boy and say what you think." The Indian looked me over whole minutes. There was a musical clock on the wall, and dolls came out and hopped while the hour struck. He looked me over all the while they did it. "Good," he says at last. "This boy is good." "Good then," says Toby. "Now I shall play my fiddle, and you shall sing your hymn, brother. Boy, go down to the bakery and tell them you are young Gert Squanfelder that was. The horses are in Davy Jones's locker. If you ask any questions, you shall hear from me." I left him singing hymns, and I went down to old Conrad Gerhard. He wasn't at all surprised when I told him I was young Gert Squanfelder that was. He knew Toby. His wife, she walked me into the backyard without a word, and she washed me, and she cut my hair to the edge of a basin, and she put me to bed, and oh, how I slept! How I slept in that little room behind the oven looking on the flower garden. I didn't know Toby went to the Embuscade that night and bought me off Dr. Kerrigan for $12 and a dozen bottles of Seneca oil. Kerrigan wanted new lace on his coat, and he reckoned I hadn't long to live, so he put me down as discharged sick. "I like Toby," said Una. "Who was he?" said Puck. "Apothecary Tobias Hurt," Farah replied. 118 2nd Street. The famous Seneca oil man that lived half of every year among the Indians. He let me tell my tale my own way, same as his brown mare used to go to Lebanon. "Then why did he keep her in Davy Jones's locker?" Dan asked. "That was his joke. He kept her under David Jones's hat shop in the Buck Tavern yard, and his Indian friends kept their ponies there when they visited him. I looked after the horses when I wasn't rolling pills on top of the old spinet, while he played his fiddle and Red Jacket sang hymns. I liked it. I had good victuals, light work, a suit of clean clothes, a plenty of music, and quiet, smiling German folk all around that let me sit in their gardens. My first Sunday, Toby took me to his church in Mortavan Alley. That was in the garden too. The women wore long-eared caps and handkerchiefs. They came in at one door and the men at another, and there was a brass chandler so you could see your face in, and a nigger boy to blow the organ bellows. I carried Toby's fiddle, and he played pretty much as he chose, all against the organ and the singing. He was the only one they let do it, for they was a simple-minded folk. They used to wash each other's feet in the attic to keep themselves humble, which Lord knows they didn't need. "How very queer," said Una. Pharaoh's eyes twinkled. "I've met many and seen much," he said, "but I haven't yet found any better or quieter or forbearinger people than the brethren and sistren of the Moravian Church in Philadelphia. Nor will I ever forget my first Sunday. The service was in English that week, with the smell of the flowers coming in from Pastor Meter's garden where the big peach tree is, and me looking at all the clean strangeness and thinking of tween decks on the Embuscade only 6 days ago. Being a boy, it seemed to me it had lasted forever and was going on forever. But I didn't know Toby then, and as soon as the dancing clock struck midnight that Sunday, I was lying under the spinet. I heard Toby's fiddle. He'd just done his supper, which he always took late and heavy. "Gert," says he, "get the horses. Liberty and independence forever. The flowers appear upon the earth, and the time of the singing birds is come. We are going to my country seat in Lebanon." I I rubbed my eyes and fetched him out of the buck stables. Red Jacket was there saddling his, and when I'd packed the saddlebags we three rode up Brace Street to the ferry by starlight. So we went traveling. It's a kindly, softly country there, back of Philadelphia, among the German towns, Lancaster way. Little houses and bursting big barns, fat cattle, fat women, and all as peaceful as heaven might be if they farmed there. Toby sold medicines out of his saddlebags and gave the French war news to folk along the roads. Him and his long-hilted umbrella was as well known as the stagecoaches. He took orders for that famous Seneca oil, which he had the secret of from Red Jacket's Indians, and he slept in friends' farmhouses, but he would shut all the windows, so Red Jacket and me slept outside. There's nothing to hurt except snakes, and they slip away quick enough if you thrash in the bushes. I'd have liked that, said Dan. I'd no fault to find with those days. In the cool of the morning the catbird sings. He's something to listen to. And there's a smell of wild grapevine growing in damp hollows, which you drop into after long rides in the heat, which is beyond compare for sweetness. So the puffs out of the pine woods of afternoons. Come sundown, the frogs strike up, and later in the fireflies dance in the corn. Oh me, the fireflies in the corn. We were a week or 10 days on the road, tacking from one place to another, such as Lancaster, Bethlehem, and Ephrata. Though Bethlehem and Ephrata. No odds, I loved going about. And so we jogged into dozy little Lebanon by the Blue Mountains, where Toby had a cottage and a garden of all fruits. He came north every year for this wonderful Seneca oil. The Seneca Indians made it for him. They'd never sell to anyone else, and he doctored him with von Swieten pills, which they valued more than their own oil. He could do what he chose with them, and of course he tried to make them Moravans. The Senecas are a seemly, quiet people, and they'd had trouble enough from white men, American and English, during the wars, to keep 'em in that walk. They lived on a reservation by themselves, way off by their lake. Toby took me up there, and they treated me as if I was their own blood brother. Red Jacket said the mark of my bare feet in the dust was just like an Indian's, and my style of walking was similar. I know I took to their ways all over. Maybe the gypsy drop in your blood helped you, said Puck. Sometimes I think it did, Pharaoh went on. Anyhow, Red Jacket and the corn planter, the other Seneca chief, they let me be adopted into the tribe. It's only a compliment, of course, but Toby was angry when I showed up with my white face painted. They gave me a side name which means 2 tongues because, do you see, I talked French and English. They had their own opinions, I've heard 'em, about the French and the English and the Americans. They'd suffered from all of 'em during the wars, and they'd only wished to be left alone. But they thought a heap of the President of the United States. Cornplanter had had dealings with him, and in some French wars out west when General Washington was only a lad. His being president afterwards made no odds to him. They always called him Big Hand, for he was a large-fisted man, and he was all of their notion of a white chief. Cornplanter'd sweep his blanket around him, and after I'd filled his pipe he'd begin, "In the old days, long ago, when braves were many and blankets were few," Big Hand said. If Red Jacket agreed to the say-so, he'd trickle a little smoke out of the corners of his mouth. If he didn't, he'd blow through his nostrils. Then Cornplanter'd stop, and Red Jacket'd take on. Red Jacket was the better talker of the two. I've laid and listened to him for hours. Oh, they knew General Washington well. Cornplanter used to meet him at Epley's, the great dancing place in the city before District Marshal William Nichols bought it. They told me he was always glad to see him, and he'd hear him out to the end if they had anything on their minds. They had a good deal in those days. I came at it by degrees after I was adopted into the tribe. The talk up in Lebanon and everywhere else that summer was about the French war with England and whether the United States would join in with France or make a peace treaty with England. Toby wanted peace so as he could go about the reservation buying his oils, but most of the white men wished for war, and they was angry because the president wouldn't give the sign for it. The newspaper said men was burning Guy Fawkes images of General Washington and yelling after